That would
Yeah.
be great.
Yeah.
Amazing. So this meeting's
Right.
being
So you
recorded.
should now have a request.
Yeah, I think we're all
Okay.
good to go.
Good. Right.
Awesome. So yeah, so this is my interview with Professor Paul Kerswill from the University of York for my HM 6815 Language and Society module. So hi there, Paul.
Hi there.
Would you mind just giving me a quick introduction about yourself and your work?
Okay. Right. Okay. I'm Paul Kerswill. I'm here at York, Professor of Social Linguistics. So my work in the past started out, I suppose, with my PhD a long time ago, which was based in Norway. So the data I got from Norway. So that was the first time I did a sort of migration study within social linguistics. That was my PhD. And then after that, I worked at Reading University for quite a long time, actually. And while I was there, I did a project on Milton Keynes, two projects on Milton Keynes. And then I got a job at Lancaster. And although I was moving away from the south of England, I did the first of the two multicultural London English studies. The first one was called Linguistic Innovators, I think, something like that. And the second one then had the words Multicultural London English in it. And I did that with Jenny Cheshire, who's probably quite well known, I think. She's recently retired.
Quite familiar with Cheshire.
Quite familiar with her name, yes. So Jenny Cheshire, Sue Fox, Avon Torgerson were so we were the team for those two projects, the MLE projects.
All big names in the A-level curriculum. So
yeah, well,
quite familiar with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I expect so. Yes, I know.
Amazing.
Yeah. So while I've been at York, where I've been for 9 years now, I haven't done any more sort of field research, if you like. I mean, I've been writing and thinking about things. One of the things I had hoped to be able to do was a project on York City dialect, but I couldn't get funding for that, even though I tried. So anyway, so right now, actually, I seem to have branched right away from sort of standard social linguistics to more applied linguistics in West Africa.
Oh, interesting.
Ghana, to be precise, where I've had links with the university in Accra for some time. So the project I'm trying to kickstart, we have the funding, but there are the various there aren't any problems. It's going to start soon on communication about COVID-19.
Okay.
So in
applied,
impoverished communities in the capital city.
Interesting.
So that's the thing I'll be
that's where we're at
engaged.
The moment,
That's where I'm at the moment. Yeah.
Awesome. So today, Paul, as interesting as all of that stuff sounds, today I'd like to focus mainly, as you suggested, on talking about your project and your research into multicultural London English.
Yeah, sure.
Obviously for my language and society module. So just for the first question I've got here, so how would you define multicultural London English, or MLE, I suppose, and how prevalent is it in the area where it's spoken?
Okay, how do you define it? This is something that linguists spend a long time worrying about, how to define any language variety. So we call it a language variety. I just use that word. So you can think of it as a collection of vowels and consonants, grammatical structures, vocabulary, intonation patterns, which would be characteristic of, a West Country accent or a Yorkshire accent or whatever, and then MLE might well come in that sort of category. But the problem with any accent is that you can't find sort of a hard and fast boundary. So if you think of the geographical, the sort of regional dialects of this country, then distinguishing Yorkshire from Lancashire is quite hard, because they obviously merge at the border. So with MLE, you have a different problem, because there you have also geography maybe, but it's all London, right? Let's sort of start with London.
Okay.
But then it's to do with the speakers, the origins of the speakers, and by and large, the people who can be thought of as being the creators of MLE had English as a second language.
Okay.
Or at least their parents did. Definitely their parents did in the 1980s. So so they grew up in an environment in the different parts of London, actually, East End of London particularly, but South London as well, where the majority of young people were growing up in a situation where English wasn't, in fact, the main language. Well, I mean, English is the main language everywhere, but it was not the home language of a large proportion of the young people. So the Cockney dialect or accent was present, but not to the same extent that it was, say, 50 years ago. And so these kids were, I mean, they were kids. They started out quite young, of course. Were having to work out what the accent was that they were supposed to be following, because it didn't actually have Cockney, didn't have the London accent present there, not in any sort of widespread sense, anyway. So so the fact, and of course the parents, they didn't speak English as a first language. Maybe some of the other kids, also had parents who didn't speak English as a first language. So then, coupled with, and then other things that come into play here are ethnicity, I would say, because a majority of the migrant families who moved into the East End, from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, were not white Anglo. They were not white British. And so, if ethnicity is something that divides the country, which it seems to be, then language was something that followed it at the same time. So that now, this doesn't actually mean that MLE is exclusively an ethnic minority dialect, because that simply isn't true. Because there are large numbers of kids, young people, not just kids now, of course, but young people, adults, of white British descent, ancestry, who also speak this thing. So that's and then, of course, at the other end, some of all these young people also speak versions of Cockney, of London Cockney. So that's a kind of variety. The other thing, of course, is this idea of style. And linguistic practice. And that's something that then you can think of a style as being a composite of linguistic features, but also can be behavioral features. It can incorporate slang, if you stick with the language side. It can be modes of dress. It can be music you like to listen to. Those, whole range of things.
Perfect.
And as a sort of stylistic practice, it then is something that you can use as part of your chosen identity, more or less deliberately. So you have people in Salisbury or Gloucester or wherever. I guess there's plenty of MLE type slang going around among students, I would imagine.
That was going to be the kind of one of the questions I was also going to go on to. So with this would be question 4, but that's fine. We can move around. So obviously, MLE obviously had its origins in London, hence the name. But even despite its origins, it's now gone on to it's now more well known through, like you say, music. So you've got artists like Stormzy, or you've got films. I was checking the repository, the website on York's website, and films like Attack the Block, things like that. They use that as the main dialect. So do you think, with that in mind, do you think it's possible to get some kind of little pockets of MLE communities around the UK outside of London speaking that sort of dialect with that sort of accent as much as it's prevalent in London? Or do you think it's more the multicultural face-to-face contact which generated the variety in the first place and allows it to persist?
That's a good question. And so if you go to another place where there's a high proportion of migrant families, second, third generation, for instance, Manchester. I mentioned Manchester because there's been research done there on MLE type language, which it hasn't been in other places. And so somebody called Rob Drummond, who's a name you probably know, I don't know.
I think
look him up.
And
he's done research on young people who have actually been excluded from mainstream education for various reasons. So, I mean, our project didn't have people who'd been excluded, although they were not, they were not, let's say they were, relatively early school leavers at 16, I would guess, the people that we interviewed. So he actually interviewed people around about that age who'd been excluded. And so they were quite underprivileged, they were rebellious, and they also spoke a version of MLE, although of course it wasn't, the L wasn't there.
Yeah.
But a Manchester version of it, okay.
MME.
MME or something, yeah. So what Rob Drummond likes to call it isn't MME, but MUBE, so Multicultural Urban British English.
Sure, okay.
And the thing is that it does contain a number of the same features in terms of vowels and consonants and slang, as well as Manchester features as well. And so he then speculates about whether that is because, as you say, you need that particular group of people who are in contact, have those particular, well, I think of them as language backgrounds, actually, being second language speakers of English, with Creole speaking parents, African language speaking parents, Indian subcontinent, wherever. So certainly, if you have a particular kind of mixture, you would expect to get a particular kind of outcome. But it was also quite clear to Rob that these young people were using some of the features, at least, as a sort of indicator of their sort of orientation to, well, music was one thing, but other forms of culture as well. And that if you wanted to mark yourself out as part of this particular group, you would say ting instead of thing.
Yeah.
Because in London it would be thing with an F. In my sort of speech, it would be thing with a dental fricative.
Dental fricative, yeah.
And in London it would be ting. Okay, only with that word, all right, not other words. Yeah. And that comes from Creole, essentially.
Okay,
Creole,
right.
that's where that comes from. So, and then there's associations with music and so on, and different kinds of music, and that seemed to be saved. So it's, it's both the mix of ethnicities or mix of language backgrounds and a desire to associate with certain kinds of style.
Okay,
so they go together.
Yeah, so it's like the initial creation of it obviously came from the history, and like you said, the creolized language is generational, like a generational thing, but it is possible for it to exist in other portions of the country, but it doesn't have that historical significance. It's purely a cultural sort of the cool thing.
I would say in places like Salisbury, or yes, the answer to that.
Definitely in places.
Not that many people of Caribbean origin there, although they.
No, probably not in
numbers, yeah. And so it's a style thing, and I guess among university students here. I mean, here at York, I expect there are some people who use some of the slang, at least, listen to grime music, drill music, and sort of appreciate that style. But there would be, occasional slang terms that young people generally use. So.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, interesting. So I guess that kind of moves me on to this next question. So with MLE, again, we'll just call it MLE for argument's sake, would you consider it like purely a fashionable variety, which kind of eventually falls out of favor as the speakers get older, or is it kind of more of a habitual kind of preserved identity throughout a person's life?
That's another good question, and one that we haven't yet got the answer to. I and some people in London are at Queen Mary University London, are in the midst of completing a research proposal to actually look more at London English, more broadly at London English, including older people. So this would be people who are, people in their 30s and 40s, who would have been young teenagers at the time of our original studies. So in order to try to answer that question, I mean, I think just listening to the media, listening to meet different media personalities, different actors, then yeah, the accent persists well into adulthood and forever, I suppose. And so to that extent, the Cockney accent's been pushed out. It doesn't really. I mean, having said that, there are still pockets of Cockney in Essex, essentially,
Yeah.
rather than in central London itself. Yeah, so it's ephemeral perhaps for many people. It would be fairly ephemeral. People who are not, whose central identity is not located there with that kind of style, but there are people who speak it as their first dialect.
I suppose, like we mentioned, if you've got like the group of kids from like Salisbury or a fairly like, you know, white dominated area,
yes,
it is more of a trend for those people to speak in that way. If you know, they've just, if they're suddenly going through a phase when they're a teenager where they love grime, they love Stormzy and things like that, that's what they'll incorporate, because that might be the new the clique within the school community or something. But then as they grow up and become more mature, for those people where they've just kind of tagged it onto their identity, it's very easy for it to fall off. But like you mentioned, for those people who've spoken it throughout their lives and it is a main form of their identity, it's something they might not even want to drop. They might want to keep it because it is such a you know, emotionally charged thing.
It is, yeah, and not just emotionally charged, but it's also, you know, more or less hardwired into their brains, because it's a psycholinguistic thing as well. So, you know, you acquire a first dialect, you get a second dialect, but there comes a time when it gets harder to acquire a second dialect. So that, coupled with the identity factors, means that it does actually stick throughout people's lives, or that's what we suppose. It seems to me to be quite, and other people as well, seems to me to be associated with being black. So if you think of the music that's associated with it, the majority of the artists are black, and in probably, on balance, half, or if not more, are actually of West African origin.
Right. Okay.
Rather than Caribbean origin. So Stormzy, for instance.
Sure.
Dizzy Rascal, the same thing. They're both West African. You know, they're both, you know, parents from West Africa.
Sure.
And so, and then if this, black literature as well, also young people's literature as well seems to be, to some extent, along ethnic lines. So, so that I think is. I mean, it's not easy to talk about that, but I think that is a tendency, at least.
Yeah, so, definitely. Okay, yeah, well, it's definitely something to consider. And I suppose the last question that I wanted to ask is, would you say that there's kind of a resistance towards people from that area acquiring MLE? And if that is the case, did you notice if there was any sort of noticeable traits that those individuals shared in some form? So maybe the class of the person living in that area, their biological sex, anything like that, if there was any resistance at all in that kind of
to acquiring it. Yeah,
sure.
Yes, is it? Yeah, I mean, it seems to be more of a working class thing.
Okay.
It's more male than female. That's something else that's also worth thinking about. It doesn't mean that the females don't use it. They don't use it in the same forms necessarily as the males. So there is a kind of gender divide there, and that's so if you think of, you know, language change generally being female led, in this case it's male led. It's quite clearly male led, and so, you know, it's symbolic of masculinity as well, I think, MLE. And that's one of the sort of, I hesitate to use the word problems with it, but it is certainly true that it's more associated with men than with women.
Yeah, much more androcentric.
Yeah. But that said, I mean, you know, there's a scale, I suppose, of masculinity, femininity that's involved there, and anybody can associate with it.
Sure. Okay. And in terms of like resistance towards it, is there any sort of clear resistance? I mean, I did a paper in about Irish English last semester, and there's a clear kind of social divide in Ireland between, particularly in Dublin, between people who are more than happy to speak the Dublin accent, or who speak with the Dublin variety, and mainly younger people who are vastly opposed to it. And it seems like it could almost be a bit of an opposite thing here with MLE.
Yeah, well, it's I mean, MLE is not well thought of in terms of attitudes. So
No.
if you play clips of MLE to people, it's there with Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Really.
Yeah.
But there's also plenty of evidence that it's a positive identity marker also for many of the speakers, as you'd expect. But the jury is out on whether it sort of affects people's promotion chances.
Sure.
At work in professional occupations. There's a study called Accent Bias Britain, which is based here at York with a colleague of mine, John Watt, and also people at Queen Mary University of London. Devyani Sharma is the key person there. And so they looked at various regional accents and sort of class accents as well in this country, in terms of whether they would be acceptable in the legal profession among lawyers.
Okay, yeah.
So they've got a panel of lawyers who the effects were not that great, but RP was at the top, received pronunciation at the top.
Yeah.
And then there was also Yorkshire as well, and then there was London. So that the Yorkshire was Leeds, I think it was. So for London, there were two MLE accents, one fairly broad, strong accent, and one much less strong. And the less strong but still identifiable MLE accent seemed to rank quite closely with the RP accent in terms of acceptability.
Right. Okay.
Whereas there was the one the speaker who had used a lot more MLE features was downgraded.
Oh, okay.
So it's not all, it isn't all negative actually with regional accents in general.
Definitely. Okay. And so with that in mind, do you think that the resistance, if there is any there, would be because of, not necessarily because of historical heritage and that sort of the significance of it, it's more to do with the present moment, the fact that, like you say, there are studies out there, or there is evidence to show that some people are opposed to the variety. I mean, and that's a whole other discussion about whether people should be opposed to varieties. The quick answer is they shouldn't be, but it still exists, and that people are still actively against that. Do you think that the resistance would come about because of that potential in the future to find employment more problematic and more difficult because of that variety?
Yeah, I suppose so. Yes, and I mean, I think people have to make their own minds up about that.
Sure.
And I mean, in terms of resistance, I suppose you have the middle class teenage thing of being rebellious and then settling back into middle class life later on. So part of the rebellion can then be to pick up certain features of a local accent, including MLE type accent. But then there's an opposing pull, I suppose, from the people themselves who are, let's say, speakers of MLE most of the time, being aware of a problem with their employment, or to some extent at least.
Sure.
So this thing, there's something that's there's a well-known linguistic term, code switching.
Yeah.
You probably know the sort of linguistic meaning of that.
Sure.
Seems to have been picked up by young people, I think, both in this country and in the States.
Yeah.
In terms of switching into if you are a speaker of MLE or African American English, was the other example.
Yeah.
Then switching into something much more, shall we say, standard, like something nearer to RP or other kinds of American English, for certain purposes, and people are getting more aware of it. Apparently, I know that there are a couple of radio programs and also television programs about this kind of code switching. And so they think of code switching also as being part of the sort of linguistic style, as well as the accent or the dialect.
Okay.
And so they are aware that if they speak like this in the office, wherever they're working, people are going to frown at them.
Yeah.
And that's problematic. And they find that problematic. They say, look, why do we have to do this? You don't have to code switch because you're fine.
Yeah, exactly.
We have to do this. you know.
Yeah.
And so some people are just very adept at it, and you know, rise through the ranks, but they still have so they can still call on MLE when they're with their friends.
Yeah, it kind of has that kind of social power, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Where, like you say, it's almost like you could compare it to a business suit. Like somebody could go into like a law firm or something and code switch to something a bit more estuary, a bit more London variety from 9 to 5, and then when they go to the pub with their mates, they can just switch to something that's a bit more socially acceptable. That's really interesting, actually. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, and that.
Yeah, I mean, that's everything that I've got.
Well, that's great. Yes.
From me, that's all, 4 of the questions answered, and that's all. Yeah, really interesting. Like I say, I remember covering this briefly at A level, but it's really nice to talk to the man himself and to get more information on it. So,
well, it's nice to hear that, you know, a tiny bit of impact out there.
Yeah, definitely. It's been great. So, would you mind just stopping the recording there?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that, and interesting conversation.
No worries, yeah, and I'll keep you posted on how I'm doing it and things like that. I'll drop you an email if you've ever got 5 minutes.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you, Paul. Pleasure.
Okay, bye.
Pleasure speaking to you. See ya.
Bye.